Dirty Moderates, one of the things we don't do very well in this country, this great country, is deal with mental health and talk about it properly. Many people suffer in silence, especially men, but not only men, but certainly many a military veteran. And it's rare to read people who can put on paper their experience in a very searing, vulnerable, but urgent way. That's exactly what my guest today has done. I'm really excited and honored to welcome to the podcast, Jason Kander. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Let me just, by way of introduction, Jason is a former Army captain who served in Afghanistan. He was the first millennial ever elected to statewide office. He is a son of Missouri. He's the president of national expansion at the Veterans Community Project, which is a not-for-profit organization. He hosts his own podcast also, Majority 54, which you should listen to. And Jason's memoir is called Invisible Storm, a soldier's memoir of politics and PTSD. As I mentioned in my intro, not something that people talk about enough. Wouldn't you say, just in general, when it comes to mental health?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's really why I decided to write the book. I just felt like, the book came out in 2022, but as I was writing it, I felt like I was sort of writing it for me back in like 2007, 2008, when I'd first come home. But it turns out, there's an awful lot of people out there, whether they served in the military or not, who have trauma and haven't dealt with it. And so I tried very hard to write the book for those people without, loading it down with the lexicon of therapy, but instead just trying to relate what it feels like to have undiagnosed and untreated trauma, and then what it felt like to get it treated.
Yeah. What I thought was interesting is you wrote in your book that it was about 1980 that the term PTSD came into, I guess, the lexicon properly, right? It was shell shock or fatigue. There were all sorts of different words used before. Before we get into your memoir, can we step back? Because I think a lot of these words, ADHD, a lot of these words get thrown around. What exactly is post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yeah, well, post-traumatic stress is when somebody has a trauma and then, and this is not a clinical definition, I'm not a clinician, but it's when you have a trauma and your brain sort of gets stuck in that trauma. So something happens. In my case, I went to war. I dealt with the dangers of being in a combat zone and being outside the wire there. And when I came home, without me understanding it, my brain never really accepted the idea that I was home and that I was safe. And so it continued to operate as though I was in this dangerous place going through this dangerous stuff. And so, there's a reason that your brain does that initially, which is to protect you. If I were going about life in Afghanistan the way I now go about life post-therapy, I don't know how long I'd last. But the important thing is that when you come home, or when when the trauma is over, being able to adapt back to regular life. And for whatever reason, my brain did not do that. And so I had to go through therapy in order to address it.
Right. To dive into your memoir, for those that are listening, and those, we have a lot of keen political observers who listen to the podcast. You all may remember or know of Jason from his time as a sort of superstar, Missouri Rising Democratic Star, and all the things that attended it. And I think for those that don't know, you write in the beginning of your memoir how on a very difficult day when you checked yourself into the VA hospital and were talking to the doctor, you said Obama wanted you to run for president. And the guy said, well, run for what? Basically, I'm paraphrasing. And then he said, are you okay? Well, maybe we should check you. And you sound like you're hearing voices. So So I know that you ran for the Missouri House of Representatives and subsequently Secretary of State after your tour in Afghanistan. But let's go to the beginning of the memoir, which is an amazing way to start. Not amazing, probably the wrong word, kind of searing way to start. But that take us through that. I mean, because it is really going backward before you get into what informed you, your time at Georgetown as a law student, your passion, not only for poli-sci your whole life, but what you went through and how proud you were to serve. But let's talk about that first moment when you checked in and how it led to the doctor saying, you sure you're okay?
Yeah. Well, so I at the time, I was running for mayor of Kansas City, and I had gone from running for president without saying the words "I'm running for president" because it invoked some legal stuff. So, but everybody knew. I mean, I was in New Hampshire and Iowa a lot. I'd gone to 47 states in a year and headlined events. And
this was in 2016. Is that when this was?
This would be like, now we're in like 2017, 18.
Okay.
So I'm, getting ready to run in 2020. And I was getting progressively worse. And I had not acknowledged to myself that it was PTSD, but I knew something was wrong. And so what I ended up doing in 2018 was deciding, well, instead of running for president, I surprised a lot of people. I said, I'm going to run for mayor of Kansas City, which, I'm a 5th generation Kansas City and I love my hometown. And I said to myself, well, I'll become mayor and then I'll get to work on things that, are in my hometown. And that'll fill the void. I thought maybe that would solve what was wrong with me inside. And I got 99 days into that campaign, and it was clear that while we were on track to win by a healthy margin, which sounds like bragging, but if you go from running for president to running for mayor of your hometown, like, you really ought to be the front runner. And I was. And but I was getting worse and worse. I developed like suicidal thoughts. And so finally, I went to the VA, and I ended up, after answering a few questions, I ended up on suicide watch. I was in a little cell, basically, where they took away all my belongings, and I put me in like these scrubs that were several sizes too big. And finally, the psych resident came in, and as they were checking me in, people were recognizing me. Nobody was unprofessional or saying anything, but you can tell when people recognize you. And it was a little bit humiliating because I was on suicide watch. And then the psych resident, who was pretty new, came in, and it was clear he didn't know who I was. And so we have this conversation for a few minutes where he asked me, a bunch of questions about my symptoms. He was really one of the first people I had ever told about my symptoms. And then toward the end of it, he says, well, do you have like a particularly stressful job or something? And I said, well, I'm in politics. And he said, what does that mean? And I said, well, I was getting ready to run for president, and then I decided to run for mayor, but I'm going to, give all that up because I want to come here and get help. And he said, what does that mean? You were going to run for president? President of what? And I said, of the United States. And he, remember, I'm sitting on this stainless steel bed in scrubs that are several sizes too big because I'm a patient on suicide watch. And I'm explaining casually that I was a presidential candidate. It's not a big deal. And so he says, well, who told you could run for president? And now I've gone from embarrassed that so many people are recognizing me to kind of irritated that this guy doesn't believe me. So I said, well, look, I spent an hour and a half, just me and Obama in his office, and he seemed to think it was a pretty good idea. And he thinks about that, and he says, Barack Obama told you could run for president. I'm like, yeah. And he said, so how often would you say you hear voices? And so that was my first day at the VA. But yeah, like to describe my political ascent, I was the Secretary of State of Missouri. As you mentioned, I was the first millennial ever elected to a statewide office. I was elected when I was 31. Yeah. I served one term, and then I ran for the U.S. Senate against an incumbent who had been in public office longer than I'd been alive.
Roy Blunt, right?
Yeah,
sure.
And so that was, November of 2016, I was on the ballot. We ran a great race. Trump actually won my state by 19. He won it by more than he won Mississippi. But on the same day, I lost by 2.8. And in the week prior to the election, we had a pretty good lead in the polls. Roy Blunt, told me afterwards that his polls showed me in the lead. The Comey letter happened and it hurt us. But, we ended up outperforming the Democratic ticket by like 16 points. And I'm, I didn't run as a Republican. I ran as what I am. I know this podcast called The Dirty Moderate, but I'm a pretty progressive guy, and that's how I ran. And despite that, we came very close. And so that got a lot of buzz. And next thing I knew, President Obama was publicly saying nice things about me, and then privately counseling me. And that's where I ended up, in a position to run for president. And then the rest of the story I just told you is what kicked in from there.
It's very interesting, as a political observer, to talk about Missouri, or as some call it, Missouri. You probably don't call it that, but I knew people that did. They'd call it Missouri, and I thought it was a joke, but no, it wasn't.
Well, it depends on the word that comes after it. If it's like a soft H, I'm probably going to do Missouri. but like the Missouri House of Representatives, Missouri House doesn't really work. My grandmother said Missouri, my grandpa said Missouri. So,
Yeah, no, it's interesting, but it used to be as Missouri goes, so goes the nation. There was always something of a bellwether. There were exceptions. Of course, that hasn't been the case since Bill Clinton carried the state twice. It looked like maybe in 2008, Obama narrowly almost got it.
Yeah, he was 2,500 votes short. And
2,500
really,
votes
if they'd done a recount, a lot of people think he would have won. But yeah, what changed is, Missouri demographically changed. We used to demographically line up perfectly with the rest of the country. Not so much anymore. And then culturally, there's been a shift. I mean, I like to joke that, Missouri joined the Southeastern Conference in college sports and also in politics. And that's what happened is our politics went from being a lot more like that sort of traditional Democratic Midwestern Iowa, Minnesota thing to much more of a Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas sort of deal.
Yeah. I mean, it is, after all, the state of the great Harry Truman, but that's a different time, and the Democratic Party has, you mentioned being progressive, and we speak to everybody from all sides on the show. The Democratic Party has different shades of progressivism depending upon where you are, and where you stand. I mean, I'm not a Democrat, but I'm Team Blue because the other side is insane. And Trumpism is a threat to democracy. It can't be said enough. We say it here all the time, but I do think that what's great about the country, and also frustrating, is we've always been a national experiment that isn't national. We've got 50 countries. I just had Joseph Ellis, the great historian, on talking about how even at the founding, colonists in Virginia didn't want to pay for the materiel and boots of their New York comrades in arms. It's always been a dispute. But what does work in Missouri, I think that where the Democrats stumble, and it's fine by me because I'm not voting Republican at the moment, or not at least in the near future, is I think that there are things that could be people in Missouri may want that maybe people in New York City or Washington don't want. And I think that gets lost. All of which is to say, I think you are a great person to have led the charge when I watched you, because I think you did communicate. You didn't deviate from your values, but I think you understood how to speak to people who might have different viewpoints than you. And I thought that was terrific. Right. And of course you have the military background and a great story, but you don't condescend and you don't come off like somebody who is out of touch with the fact that not everybody is on the same page culturally. I'm pretty socially left in my views, more fiscally right. So, I mean, I don't have a lot of indulgence for, the pro-life movement and the anti-gay movement, all that stuff. But, again, threading the needle and meeting people where they're at is something I think you did very well.
Thanks.
And I was impressed by that. And I wonder if it isn't tied into just the sense of mission that you, even though you describe yourself as, or I've heard you describe yourself as a poli-sci nerd or your whole life, you ended up in politics, not an accident. The sense of mission that the military gave you. I wanted to read the beginning of chapter 1, the uniform. I thought it was a great first paragraph for your readers. Something happens to you, right? Something happens to you the first time you put on a uniform. I think this is true for anyone, from an orchestra conductor putting on a tux, to a nurse slipping into scrubs, to a UPS driver getting dressed in the brown ensemble. The first time you see yourself in that uniform, a strange clarity settles over you. Suddenly you are part of something. When you look in the mirror, you don't see someone wearing clothes anxiously picked out that day. Instead, you see someone with a place in the world, creating music, healing people, delivering packages, a job, a purpose, or in my case, a mission. That's what you write. And it's incredibly powerful, but look at how you wove in the nurse, the UPS worker, I mean, that's like the Democratic Party is the common man, as it used to be.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
And that's, it's amazing to liken your mission, personal story about going off into the military and making it, relevant to people who do their mission, who do their job. I thought that was a wonderful way to communicate.
Oh, well, thanks. When I think about who I was at that time in my life, let's see, we're talking the first time I put on a uniform, it was 2002. So I'm 21 years old. And and if you think about my generation, I'm a senior millennial, right? So I'm on the upper end of the millennial generation, or the early end. And, there's a reason, and this is before Barack Obama really hit the national political scene, but there's a reason that my generation responded to Obama the way we did, is that really nobody had ever asked anything of us. We had been through 9/11, and George W. Bush had issued a charge to the country, which was go shop to help the economy. And then he said, he was going to cut taxes. And I just think, I still believe that was a missed opportunity to ask people to volunteer, to give of themselves. And I believe that there was a large chunk of my generation, myself included, that wanted something to be asked of us and wanted some sort of clarity about what we could do to make the world a better place. And so obviously I was devastated when 9/11 happened, but there was also a part of me that understood that it could give my life a certain amount of meaning. And now I had a mission, I had a charge, and I was absolutely eager to serve my country as a result.
Yeah. So take us through that. I mean, this was 2002, but of course, after graduating high school, you went to American University. So you were in DC, and you were studying poli-sci there, right? Was that right?
Yeah, basically pre-law, but yeah, pretty much.
So you knew you were going to go to law school. You ended up at Georgetown.
Yeah.
So you stayed in DC, but you didn't like law school, as you write about. You didn't feel that, which is not unusual, but tell us about going to, you go to Georgetown, fantastic first-rate law school, and you just really didn't want to be there. You were bored by torts.
Yeah. I think had 9/11 not happened, maybe I would have gotten excited about it, because probably what I would have done is I would have tried to put that energy. I come from a public service oriented family, which is to say, it's not like I have people in my immediate family that served in elected office or anything, but, growing up, my mom and dad met working as juvenile probation officers, and my dad had been a police officer, as his second job. And so then
he became a civilian airplane instructor, right?
Yeah. Prior to that. And so I just, and it was never like, you will go into public service. We were never told what we were supposed to do. But my parents had also taken in kids who were my best friends and became my brothers, whose families were struggling. And we call them my unofficial foster brothers. And so I was searching for a life of meaning. And so I think had 9/11 not happened, I probably would have gotten into something like civil rights law and maybe really dug my teeth into law school as a result. I think, I was really interested in service in the military, but had 9/11 not happened, I think there's like a 50% chance I would have eventually joined like the JAG Corps Reserve or something. I certainly would not have become an Army intelligence officer. I don't think, but 9/11 changed everything. And so as a result, I'm going through ROTC training, and then I'm doing my weekends in the Guard with an infantry unit, and I'm learning all this stuff that did fascinate me and seemed immediately relevant. It was small unit tactics and how to soldier and how to lead soldiers. And so as a result, sitting in, contract law was just unbearable for me. Hey, I wanted to get back out and continue my training all the time.
Yeah. So talk about how you enlisted. Talk about before we even get into what you did there. I know you ended up in intelligence, but talk about that being an ROTC. Like, what's that like? Because it was always apparent at my school and graduate school, but it was something I never did. So, what's it like? Tell us, everybody.
Well, I was really fortunate that Georgetown has one of the best programs, one of those ROTC battalions in the country. It was, a few years ago, I think it was rated number 1. And so I had the benefit of having, Army officers and Army non-commissioned officers running the program, active duty folks who were just fantastic. And I really feel like I would put the people who were trained in the ROTC program at Georgetown and the Army program up against the folks coming out of West Point in terms of their skills, their ability to lead troops, their tactical know-how. And so what it was like was, I'm going to law school. I did end up, finishing law school. But the whole time I'm spending at least 3 days a week, getting up at like 0500 and showing up for physical training. And then also having, like my leadership classes, in uniform a couple of days a week. And then pretty much every weekend you're doing training either at Fort Myer or Fort AP Hill or Fort Belvoir, in those places near DC. And then on top of that, I enlisted in the Guard. So I was in what was called the simultaneous membership program. So I was a cadet, earning my commission as a second lieutenant in the Army. But I was also, in a rifle company in a battalion in Maryland, in the Maryland Army National Guard. So getting to learn a little more of a ground level soldier's view. So, and I just ate it up. I mean, it just made sense to me. I like you, that portion you read, I felt like I had a place in the world, and I felt fully utilized by it because it was hard. That's the other thing. It was, look, I grew up pretty privileged. I mean, there's nobody who was able to make a decision politically, certainly, that would ever take food off our family's table. And my hardest hard luck stories at that point in my life were like, high school baseball games and high school debate tournaments, which are not that hard of stories. And so now I'm, out in the woods, not getting much sleep, living on MREs and, marching really, really far and really, really tired and trying to concentrate and carrying a lot of equipment. And that was hard. And I liked how hard it was.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the time, because you did a 4-month tour in Afghanistan, right? Mm-hmm. And you were there from, was it October of 06 to February of 07, roughly?
Yeah,
right?
I'm impressed. You read and took notes. Well done.
Yeah, well, I love the book, of course. And I saw in the and this sort of helps inform my next question on page 74, which is the end of chapter 4. After you had, well, we're going to get into it after you wanted to go back in and you didn't get the waiver you needed, right? There was a waiver that was required. You wrote this: something happened when I took off that uniform for the last time, something terrible. The part of me that I liked and respected the most died. It had only been a few months since my commander had refused to sign that form to release me to active duty. In a short time, I went from being sure that I'd finally be able to fix what was wrong with me to no longer being an officer in the U.S. Army. And now I was a civilian. I sat down on the bed and wondered if I should cry, but I couldn't. It had been a very long time since I'd been able to cry. I was deeply sad, but I felt I had no right to mourn. I had survived Afghanistan, had done only one 4-month tour during which nothing bad happened to me. Why didn't I feel lucky or grateful? What possible right did I have to mourn anything? There were so many soldiers who didn't make it back.
Yeah,
that says a lot. I mean, that's like a sort of capsulized version of the whole book, of what you faced. Talk about that. I mean, the guilt, and that obviously were these the first feelings that you had that conjured up, or that were conjuring up a sense of kind of traumatic stress of any kind?
No, I didn't know it, but I had been, ever since I came home, I had been having symptoms of, I'd had everything from like an eye twitch that took forever to go away to really bad nightmares to being, sort of on alert all the time. And then of course, all of that eventually got worse. But at that point, what I had begun to develop unknowingly, and what I discovered later in therapy as is sort of act 3 of the book, as is that what I learned is that I had become emotionally numb because I had all these disturbing thoughts and emotions that were upsetting, but I didn't know what to do with them. And so all I really knew how to do was to try to numb myself from them. And so that's why, I say in that part that I thought I should cry, but I really couldn't, because I had so numbed myself of both positive and negative emotions. The interesting thing about that 10 years of my life is that as I became more and more successful, and rose politically, my self-confidence, which had always been very strong thanks to my upbringing, I guess, was going up like a rocket. My self-esteem was going way down. And so they were sort of passing each other. And so I thought very poorly of myself as a human being and very highly of my abilities professionally. And so as a result, the only part about me I found redeeming was the fact that I was a soldier. And when I looked in the mirror, that's what I saw. Even though at that point, I was a member of the state legislature, I was a practicing attorney, but I didn't think of myself as those things. I thought of myself as a soldier who did those things.
Right. So to back up, you get to Afghanistan in October of 2006. Did you at the time believe that it was the right thing to do, that we were in Afghanistan?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, we're
Yeah.
talking, 06, 07 was a very different time than the last
Sure.
few years in Afghanistan. I mean, at that point, we're talking years before we had gotten bin Laden, and
Yeah.
it was very much a mission. The other thing is, Iraq and Afghanistan were wholly different wars. I mean, a lot of people may
Yeah.
remember the term hearts and minds, but that really came from Iraq. I mean, the idea that you needed to win over the hearts and minds of the population. In Afghanistan, a good majority of the population was with us. The problem was we didn't have their confidence because, as history has borne out, Afghanistan is a very difficult place to govern. You have a lot of different tribes. You have a lot of different, countries that have tried.
I mean, the British and the Russians didn't do too well either. It's not like we were the only ones. Yeah.
Right. And so what we were trying to do, our mission was to demonstrate that the government of Afghanistan could do its job and could be effective, because what you needed to win was people's confidence so that they would help the coalition. Because the reason that they were reluctant is because it's not like an election here where you choose the wrong side and, you may not get a job. There, you choose the wrong side in a pitched battle for control that's likely a violent battle. Well, if you choose the wrong side, you and your family are going to be killed. And so it was about convincing people that the coalition and the government of Afghanistan could prevail. And I very much believed in that mission.
Yeah. And also, and I want you to speak to this a little bit, with the warring tribes and the way you have to make alliances, you're over there and you're living there, and of course you're working in intelligence, which, as you talk about, is dangerous. It's not like it's not dangerous. It's not like you're sitting in some room somewhere, sending out memos. I mean, you have to be with a translator, you're out there, but you have to earn the trust of the people and the tribes. And certainly as goodwill gets eroded from a particular, American presence or international presence there, in this case, American, you never know if someone's going to turn, right? I mean, you have the famous story. Tell us that amazing story about that one leader where you thought you were being brought in to be killed. And I don't want to give it away, so I'm trying to be purposely vague.
No, it's no problem. Yeah. Well, I'll give you the context. So my job, as you said, was as an intelligence officer, and, all sorts of people do different jobs in intelligence. My job was to do anti-corruption and anti-espionage, primarily investigations within the Afghan government and military, and also some narcotics trafficking stuff. And so what that meant was, I was doing two things. I was analyzing the information about who the people were that our generals, our ambassador, our battalion commanders, people like that were interacting with, the people in the Afghan government, and just analyzing and writing up, like, here's who's corrupt. I mean, and they all were pretty kind of corrupt to some degree, but here's to what degree they're corrupt. Here's who they're sort of in bed with. Here are the ones who are actually working with Al Qaeda or the Taliban and have infiltrated. But the thing is there was really, for the most part, nobody collecting that information. And so that was the other half of my job, was to go out and to meet people and to build relationships. My commander subsequently referred to it as Thugint, which is short for thug intelligence, which meant, as he put it, that it was my job to build relationships with thugs so that they would give us information about other thugs. So my translator and I, usually my main translator, Salam, and I, but sometimes I would use other translators. We would go out. Sometimes it would be me and a few other guys. More often than not, it would just be me and a translator, and sometimes in street clothes, sometimes in uniform, and build these relationships. And the thing about it was that meant that I had to go into a lot of meetings with people of questionable allegiance and unsavory character. And, you go in and you're sitting down and you need to project a sort of a vibe of trust. If you want people to give you the information that you want, you have to build a friendship. And that means that you can't go in and, be kicking down doors and having people stationed at every, exit. You got to sit there and you got to put your back to a door and you've got to take that risk. And so that's what I did. And, there's a few, there's several sort of adventurous things that I had to do as a result. But an illustrative story that I did put in the book is about the relationship that I had formed with the then Attorney General of Afghanistan, a guy named Sabet, who was great to talk to. He had gone to George Washington Law School, so his English was excellent. And so it was really easy to build that relationship. And also, I had gone to law school in DC, and he knew I was an intelligence officer, not an Army lawyer, but still there was a rapport there. And he had this anti-corruption, campaign that he was waging in Afghanistan. But there were also whispers that, he was corrupt to some degree as well. And so I would frequently go out and visit with him and gather information. And there was a point at which some guys from the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, wanted to go along with me. People would often want to tag along because it was a good contact. And when we got in there and we sat down, we were talking with him, and then this guy walked in who looked very familiar to me. And then when he was introduced, I realized that it was the General Haji Zahir of the Border Patrol, who was somebody we had been actively investigating. He had been working with the Taliban at the border, like closely, and running drugs at the border. He was known to do things like make an example of his rivals by cutting off their heads and putting them on stakes outside of his headquarters.
A modest proposal.
Right. Yeah. And now we were having tea with him, and three of his goons were standing behind him with AK-47s at the low ready. And when we got there, some of his other goons had met us at the vehicle, which was rare for showing up to Sabit's compound. And they had instructed us to leave our vehicles or leave our weapons in the vehicle, which, I looked at these DIA guys and thought they probably think I'm so green that I would do that, but I'm not going to do that. So I tucked my pistol under my sweater. I was in street clothes, and I did leave my body armor out there because it's kind of rude to walk in acting like you think the person you're meeting with is going to blow you up. But I concealed my pistol, and I figured so did everybody else. And we're sitting there and during this meeting, and General Zahir is getting very animated and angry. And it started to, and the other guys were looking at me like, what have you gotten us into? And we were outgunned and outnumbered. And it started to feel like there was a possibility that this was a setup. And so I started to think about, okay, if we got to do this, who am I going to shoot first? And eventually, after about 45 minutes of this sort of very tense situation, it became apparent that what this guy was actually after was to try to get us to roll up and, arrest and otherwise take care of some of his narco rivals at the border. And so we feigned interest in that, and then we got out of there. But when we got to the vehicle, I saw the DIA guys reach in and grab their pistols. And I realized I was the only person armed in there, and I'd almost preemptively taken action, which would have gotten all of us killed because it would have been me against a few guys with AKs, and we would have all been wiped out. So that was one of the stories from the book.
Yeah. Do you, reflecting back now, I mean, as you've so openly and courageously grappled with what you've gone through, and I want to talk a little bit about the work you're doing now. Do you, having been in the military culture, when I say an understanding, I don't mean you accept it or think it's okay, hence your memoir, as to why so many veterans come home with PTSD, but more than that, why they've been so slow to treat it or accept it that somehow the stoicism required, right, of just putting your character and your mission first, in a way, right, in a kind of it asks you to deny yourself the basic human emotions that come with it. And maybe that's central to military missions. I have military members or people who served in my family. Certainly. I always wonder, how can you be emotionally vulnerable and also brave, quote unquote, in the military at the same time? It's a tricky balance, and you got like you've had to pay a steep price for it as so many other, from suicidal thoughts to deep depression to, so talk about like that view.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think one of the, and you're really hitting on it. One of the misconceptions people have about veterans in particular is that that the reason that it is maybe harder to get some veterans who need help to go get help is this sense of like machismo and this idea that it's weak. And I actually think that culturally, and the military has played a big role in this, but culturally, or I'd say rather the VA has played a big role in this. I think people have gotten it across, and the VA has done a good job of getting it across that it is not weak to go ask for help. And I think that the culture of the military has changed, not entirely, but to a large degree, to where most veterans don't feel ashamed necessarily to go get help. We're getting closer and closer to viewing those wounds much more on par with physical wounds. Now, that said, to me, the reason that so many folks take longer to get help, and I know it's the reason I did, is that when you are in the military, just as you alluded to, you are taught, like from the moment you get off the bus at basic, and then after that, it's just sort of all through the ether and the culture of it, that somebody has it worse than you, that whatever you're going through is not that big of a deal. And somebody has it worse. Maybe it's somebody, in the next platoon. Maybe it's somebody in the next battalion. Maybe it's just somebody from a different war long ago, but whatever it is, what you're doing is no big deal. And the thing is, I'm not all that critical of that approach, because in order for us to do our job, we have to believe that. Like, I have to, for me to keep going, look, there are people who went through greater traumas and were in greater danger than me. But in my case, for me to keep going into meetings where I ran the risk of showing up on YouTube with somebody cutting my head off, I had to genuinely and fully believe that I was just a guy going to meetings and it's not a big deal. And then, like, for, other buddies of mine, for them to go back out on patrol when one of their buddies right next to them had been shot the day before, they had to look at it and be like, look, it's nothing compared to what second platoon is going through. I mean, that's what's in the culture, and and without it, we wouldn't win a lot of battles. Now, that said, the problem is that when we come home, nobody disabuses us of that notion. Nobody ever sits us down and says, actually, that's a big deal what you went through. And nobody did that with me. And so, I'm a guy who, I went over there, I never fired my weapon the whole time.
Wow.
And I had a conventional idea of what combat was. And so I went about 10 years telling myself, like, I'm not a combat veteran. Yeah, I served in Afghanistan, but I'm not a combat veteran. And I would have buddies of mine who were in mini firefights say to me, like, dude, I don't know if I could have done what you did. And I just thought, well, they're being generous because they know maybe I'm struggling with something, or maybe they're just being nice. And it wasn't until, about a week after that story I told a few minutes ago, that I was at the VA and I was talking to a clinical social worker, and I said all this to them, and they said, let me get this straight. You were in the most dangerous place on the planet. You would go out pretty much alone most days, with nobody knowing where you were. So nobody was coming to save you, meeting with the most dangerous people on the planet. And so you're vulnerable for hours at a time. And they were like, and you don't think you're a combat veteran? And I was like, well, when you explain it that way, and they said, yeah, you're a combat veteran. There's no question that doing that is traumatic. So that was my journey with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something to be said for, posts in the book is called The Stuff I Wish Someone Had Told Me. And there's a kind of prosaic everyday example that's deeply moving with your lovely wife, Diana, who you write about a lot in the book and whose your own journal entries you include. But you had gone into therapy, and months into it, you felt like you were doing better. And again, no one prepares you for what the post journey will be. And you write, then one day I was folding laundry with Diana, and I said casually, I really didn't have a great day today, but it's okay. I think I'll do better tomorrow. She stopped what she was doing and looked at me teary-eyed, then walked over, hugged me, and buried her head in my chest. Quietly, she said, I haven't heard you say anything like that in so long.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's unbelievable to read that, because it's just that moment that you're, you are doing better and you had a bad day, like we all do. And it's okay not to be okay,
Yeah, which is not something I knew. I mean, that's definitely not something that the Army taught me. I was not taught a lot of self-compassion by the Army. And look, I was, not as young as some when I went into the military, but I was pretty young. I was 21 years old. I had not really done much in life, as we discussed. So even today, I am very much formed by the military. And so at that point in my life, I knew what I had learned in the military, and that was about what I knew. And so, it was a big deal for me to be able to give myself grace like that, which I am much better about now. I'd also like to say these are excellent passages that you're reading, but for anybody listening, the book also is full of jokes and levity.
Oh yeah.
And so I say that so that people will actually read it, because and I did that on purpose because, for one thing, it is just funny. I mean, on its face, the concept of running for president of the United States while you
Yes.
secretly have a psychological disorder is kind of hilarious on its face.
Yeah.
And so, the book is full of pretty funny moments, but yeah, that was an important one.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the book is great because it is funny and it is improbable, and it talks about these amazing things. But also, the book is hopeful for those that, which is why when it does end with you, having a full reset in your life and having another, you have 2 children and a wonderful marriage, and that that this. I think at one point you called it the monster. The way it works, the monster didn't get you. You slayed it. It doesn't mean you don't have to battle it. It doesn't mean you can't laugh about it. It doesn't mean you can't look at it, from a distance and go, wow, what the hell was I doing in this country in a room with people who might have blown my head off? I mean, right? You have to have some of that. But again, because so many people coming out of the military and so many men are not taught to emote, it's important not to suggest listen, this is not a melancholic read where everybody should go and, never laugh again. But I think it's important that you're vulnerable in the book.
Absolutely.
It's your character. It's probably so much of what, made you an effective person on the political stump, is, again, you can listen to people and feel where people are coming from. So it isn't abstract, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think I accept the endorsement and I appreciate it.
So in terms of, the world we're in today, we're at this, again, it's overused, but it's true, this inflection point in our politics. And, we're facing I still believe the fundamentals favor Biden, but you can never be so sure, and we can never stop working hard to prevent that.
Right.
What do you think, especially as a Democrat and someone who served in the military, about this whole idea that we now have, it's hard to believe, the party of Reagan has become kind of this isolationist crank set, that doesn't want to help our allies in the most part. In many ways, believes in a guy who called military veterans losers and suckers, insulted John McCain, all in the name of some kind of horrible reclaimed patriotism, although I hate to use that word. Well, what's your take on that as an American who served, not just as a Democrat, but what do you think of our contemporary cesspool?
Yeah, well, my wife came to the United States as a refugee from Soviet Ukraine in 1989, and she was 8 years old. And so, I remember on January 6th talking to her about it, and she said, there's this assumption that's been baked into American culture for so long. She said that I never understood, which the assumption is that, well, we disagree on things, but we all believe in the fundamental principles of America, and we all believe in democracy. And she's like, I've never thought that everybody believed in that, because I come from a country where, it wasn't a democracy. And so,
right.
And I think that's important because what is happening in America right now, to me, is much larger than America. I mean, there's a conflict sweeping across the entire world at the moment, and it is a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism. And I think that people are inclined to believe that Trumpism is original to the United States, and that it is this thing that has just started here, that was brought in by Trump a few years ago. And I feel like what is actually happening is that tragically, we had a guy like Trump who was perfectly positioned to ride a wave that was coming to developed, mostly Western and democratic nations across the world, which is the wave of authoritarianism becoming more popular. And that's what's going on in the world right now. And so this election, each election at this point, is America re-upping which side of that it's going to be on. And there's no reason to believe that it's a foregone conclusion that America will continue to pick the side of democracy and freedom and go against the side of authoritarianism, because we're a pretty young country, really. And, we are the longest lasting democracy in the world ever. at this point. And so the idea that we will just automatically continue on that path is wrong. And so my view is we can't take it for granted. And there's at this point two teams. It's team democracy and team authoritarian. And I'm very much on team democracy. And so, that's how I see it right now. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you, but I want to focus on Missouri for a second. Okay.
Sure.
Because one of the things that I think I always check myself, I say, Adam, are you lucky to be able to just believe democracy is the most important issue? You know what I mean? I mean, are you able to say, hey, nothing else matters? Because I'm just trying to play devil's advocate with myself and a bit with you. You're in a state, that's red. There's blue, but there's a lot of red. Mm-hmm. I mean, don't you think there's something to be said? And I'm not blaming the Democrats per se or anybody, that there are swaths of people in rural America who don't feel heard and feel listened to. I mean, do you think that these?
Oh, for sure.
Right. I mean, I don't think that all these people, if you go into Jefferson City, or Cape Girardeau or something, I'm just trying to think of places, or, Joplin, that you've got a bunch of authoritarians running around. I think Trump is the fuck youism of politics, as a wise man once said. And they like that. And they see condescending elites, which is not new to America. Looking down on them, and Trump feels like the manifestation of their frustrations. How do you agree with that? And B, how do you reach those people? I mean, you're there. See, I think you're a real talent and could do this. Bill Clinton could do it, but how do you do it with brass tacks? Talk to that.
Well, populism, which is really what the Missouri brand of politics is, much more so than conservatism. Populism is a choice. You're historically in the United States, a buddy of mine said this to me once, it made a lot of sense. Historically in the United States, populism is going to ask you to either blame brown people or rich people. And that's really what the debate is in this country. And look, the Republican Party, particularly the Trump wing of the Republican Party at the top level, is a bunch of rich people who would prefer you blame brown people.
Right.
And I come from a populist sort of philosophy that says, I don't think brown people are to blame here. I think it's probably rich and powerful people. And what happens in Missouri is I agree with what you're saying, that there are a lot of unheard people and people who are not being spoken to. But I think that the mistake that a lot of particularly Democrats from the coast usually make is an assumption that the way to reach those people is by taking more conservative positions, by demonstrating sort of a distance between yourself and other Democrats. And what I think my candidacies in Missouri demonstrated is that it is actually about making this populist progressive case in a way that resonates with people here. And for example, I don't think that the reason that, elected Democrats on the coast are sometimes out of touch with a place like the middle of the country or the South is that their policies are out of touch. I think it's the way we talk about them. I mean, you name me a Democratic policy. It doesn't, it could be student loans. We'll pick student loans. Look, I've been in every county in the state. There's 115 of them. And I've asked the question in every county. I've said, raise your hand if your financial situation is directly affected by either your student loans or someone in your families. And like 90% of hands go up. Well, then the question is Biden's policy on student loans, how can it not be super popular? Well, because we're not characterizing it in a way that really resonates with what people care about here. The difference between living in the middle of the country and living in a place like New York or LA or San Francisco or even Chicago is that one of our greatest anxieties is that our kids will have to move away in order to find opportunity. And that's not an anxiety in those places. And that doesn't change the policies you're for, but it changes how you talk about the policies. I believe that that what everybody wants, particularly here in the middle of the country, is they want their family to be happy, to be healthy, to be safe, and to be nearby.
Yep.
And as Democrats, we're doing okay sometimes about the happy part. We're very good with the healthy part. We have the market cornered on things like healthcare and that kind of thing. We're getting better at safe because we're learning that when people say that they're worried about crime, frequently what they mean is gun crime, and we're leaning into it unapologetically that we want gun safety, and we absolutely whiff at nearby. And when in 2016, when Donald Trump came through and started talking about bad trade deals, I promise you that a lot of people who hadn't been voting Republican, who voted for him, were not looking at the details of NAFTA and making a decision. But what they heard him saying was, your kids won't have to leave in order to be successful. And that means that you won't have to move away from your home in order to be near your grandkids. And we should be saying that much more plainly about our policies, because that's what they actually do, is they prevent people from having to leave their homes.
No, I think that's well said. And I think it's like in the immediate post-war era, right, when unions had their highest level of membership and prosperity was at its greatest, right? You had a robust middle class. The United States moves into being this sort of great world empire. But what people forget is that there really was a rising tide lifting all boats. Again, it was a different country, it's a different time. CEOs didn't make 400 times their employees. Different world, of course. Wage stagnation hadn't crept in yet. It was certainly, we're talking about the late 40s and 50s and early 60s. But the one thing I will say, though I disagree with his prognosis, Bernie Sanders, I'm about to say, agree with his diagnosis. And this is I always say this to Democrats, and I think this would work in Missouri, is the thing that unites people that you're also talking about is class, is that people do feel left behind. And I think the mistake, and I say it all the time, and it's not an insignificant problem. By the way, I don't think the problems are symmetrical. I think the right, to be clear, for those that'll soundbite this, is the greater threat to democracy. But I think there are illiberal tendencies rampant on the left, that do come out of the coasts, that are they're obsessed with race and they're obsessed with identity. And that is not a unifying message, because we come from all backgrounds and places, immigrant or otherwise. Some of us are biracial, some of us are multiracial. That's not what it's about. Everything's not about this person or that person, but there are things that unify us. Bernie Sanders is one of the few Democrats, or I guess he's not really a Democrat, but one of the few progressives who speaks to the unification of whether it's healthcare and poverty and things like that. I agree with you. It's not a losing message, but I think it gets turned into, well, it's all because there's a so-and-so power structure here. It's like, okay, just not everybody's going to come to it at that place. They want to know how you can help them. They don't want to be told that because somebody is in Appalachia or Missouri, they're still better off than somebody who's in a poor, disenfranchised neighborhood. It's not, A, I don't know that it's true. And B, I don't think it's helpful. And I think the Democrats, I don't disagree that Democrats have a lot of winning issues on their side, but I think that trips them up. What do you say about that?
Well, I think voters are willing to vote. I mean, they're really quite willing to vote for people who they disagree with, so long as they believe that candidate believes what they believe because they care about people like them.
Yep.
And in the absence of that, they will accept voting for people who don't like the same people they don't like.
Yeah.
But that is, I promise you, a far, far second choice. They would rather vote for people who they feel like care about them. Yep. So to me, it's not about de-emphasizing race. It's more about, absolutely, I think Democrats should continue to talk about racial inequality. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we are not falling into the trap of pitting some of our voters against one another, because as you said, a rising tide does lift all boats. I mean, look,
and by the way, to be completely fair to the Democrats, the right are the ones that channel this and propagate. They're doing the division, of course, and the left does the division. But sometimes it's well-meaning, but then they react by saying, "Yes, but we need all these It's like, okay, you can't legislate attitudes always, but you can legislate change in policies.
The right has done a very good job of trying to force the left into that position. I mean, if you look at the way redistricting has played out in states like mine and in the South, which, depends on who you ask, we are either a part of it or we're not. It depends on what day of the week it is. But the objective has been to make the Democrats the minority party, not just in the sense that they are the minority in terms of their number of representatives, but the party of minorities. Because then what you do is when you make it so that every elected Democrat in a state seems to be a person of color, what you are signaling on purpose to white people is, well, that's not your party.
Correct.
And so that's the Republicans doing that.
Yeah,
Now,
I agree.
there's nothing you can do about that, but what you can do is you can keep in mind, and none of this has to come at the expense of trying to work hard to convince and to turn out and to serve, most importantly, to provide services to people of color, voters of color. But what is important to remember, and then what I think a lot of progressives, particularly on the coasts or just in big cities across the country, forget, is that it's simple math, is that if we are going to have victories, and if we're going to have a lasting governing majority of any kind, you cannot do it exclusively with people who are already progressive. You actually have to change people's minds. That's what, shameless plug, but my podcast, Majority 54, is about helping the 54% of the country who consistently votes for progress convince everybody else in individual, familial and personal and friendly relationships. And so, that's really where I come down, is it's like, I'm a guy who, I'm a huge believer in fighting against racial inequality. And at the same time, I think that a lot of the messages that are aimed at folks, Black folks, brown folks in this country, we should be aiming the same messages in a lot of ways at white folks who are getting screwed by corporate America and by a corporate Republican Party.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things you do see, and I think this ties into the kind of messaging you're talking about, I think the Republicans are seizing on it cynically, but they're doing it. Trump is such a horrible human being, but he does have a sort of ability to read the street smart sweet spot of people. The Democrats are facing problems with male Black and Latino voters. Of course, Biden's going to win the majority, but they're going to lose those voters, some of them, and elections are one of the margins, so those things matter. And I think part of it is that there's a sort of small business entrepreneurial working guy message that is not aimed. I think it's working class people, white, Black, brown, and otherwise, who are exiting the Democratic Party. It's not just rural whites anymore, because I think people do feel, hey, how are these policies speaking to me? It's not necessarily the policies can't or don't speak to them. It's like you said, it's how they're not being communicated. But I think it's something to watch. And I think Democrats have to stop ignoring it and saying, oh, those are just Black sellouts. It's like, don't say that. People are out there working hard and they don't feel the Democratic Party speaking to them. They're not going to vote for you. Don't bring in Ivy League, and I went to Ivy League schools, Ivy League racial narratives that have no meaning to people who are working out there. Speak to them. That's all I'm saying. I want you guys to win, but you got to speak to them. You can't dismiss it.
Yeah. My friend David Axelrod likes to say that if you tell voters you don't need them, they will believe you.
Mm-hmm.
And so
I agree with him.
Yeah. That's, I think what you're talking about.
Yeah. But the thing I love, by the way, back to your story, I want to end with or hear more about what besides the podcast, about the work you're doing with veterans. Cause I think, that doesn't get enough attention. I also think the Obama years didn't it do really well for veteran homelessness? I mean, I remember reading
there were some strides forward. Yeah. Nothing like we need, but
nothing like we need. But talk about the work you're doing now, because I do think, again, one of the things we do terribly as a country is send people off to war and they come home and, of course there's a VA and there's PTSD, but there's a lot of people who get nothing. They're left alone. They're left without. They served, and hey, man, you're on your own. And I think that's terrible. Talk about the stuff you do in your organization.
Sure. Yeah. So so I stepped back from everything in 2018. And then in 2019, after a few months of going to therapy at the VA and it going very well for me, I became the president of national expansion at a place here in Kansas City called Veterans Community Project. And so now what we do is we build villages of tiny houses with wraparound case management services for homeless veterans, and also run outreach centers for at-risk veterans. And so what I do now is I build these villages around the country, and I literally get to help my fellow veterans, get home safely. And it's the best civilian job I've ever had. It's also no coincidence, it's the longest civilian job I've ever had. Now I'm coming up on 5 years in this role, and I've taken the team that I have the privilege of leading has taken a heralded social service agency that was doing amazing stuff in Kansas City, and now it has become the national leader in preventing and reversing veterans homelessness. So we have an 85% success rate with people we serve of transitioning them into permanent housing successfully. And it's a great job. I love it. People who are interested in supporting us, we're almost entirely privately funded, can go to vcp.org. So it's like veteranscommunityproject.org.
VC, I was just going to say, where do we find you? And Jason, where can people find you on Twitter and the socials if people want to follow your amazing story?
Oh, thanks. So I'm at Jason Kander. It's Kander with a K, Kander. So it's JASONKANDER. And I'm on Twitter and Threads and Instagram and TikTok. And so
you're everywhere. Folks, before we go, there are many of you, I think most of you probably know my former life as a Broadway producer, and Jason is the great nephew of the iconic John Kander, who with Fred Ebb is as pivotal a Broadway songwriting team as any, from the Tony Award winning hits of Cabaret in Chicago, but of course writing the classic anthem New York, New York, among many other things. For musical theater geeks, he is a Kander. So I love it. And I had to give that plug, but he's also an amazing force. I think, and I'm not going to force you to do anything because I can't, but I think you're a superstar in Missouri, could use you. So I really hope you go in elective office. Democrats need guys like you, but also you're talking honestly and openly. Your memoir, Invisible Storm, it's a must read, folks. If you have not yet read Jason Kander's memoir, and your work with veterans, indispensable. So thank you so much. I want to thank you for joining us here on the podcast. It's really been a pleasure.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, as always, stay dirty, stay moderate, and stay safe.